Could stories actually change you? That's the topic that we're going to address today on Flourishment. I'm your host, Tina Yeager, and today I have a Christie Award-winning author with me. Her name is Sarah Brunsvold, and she is here to talk to us about how stories can be super transformative, not just in literature characters, but in our character. Welcome, Sarah. I am so delighted to have you on Flourishment today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Tina. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you talk about why you chose this particular context of transformative story as something that you would explore in your fiction and in the nonfiction research you did to get ready for that?
I believe that story does have a way of speaking into our lives in the ways that maybe nonfiction can't reach. It allows us to see ourselves and see the world through eyes that are not necessarily our own, but it's kind of a safe way to explore emotions that maybe we would be afraid of exploring on our own, or going into a different experience that's parallel to our own, but allows us to see new things about our own experiences. So I love that idea. I love how story has shaped my own life. Particularly the greatest story ever told, that of Jesus Christ. And God is a God of story, and He has gifted people with the ability to tell stories for a reason, and it is to help His children see things in new light, and to see them in the light of heaven, most importantly. So that's what kind of drew me into this idea of writing a book about books, a story about stories and how they can impact our lives.
For practical application, I do want to point out the psychology that's behind this, which you might already be aware of, Sarah. But our psychology is set in such a way as human beings, as we were created, to be inspired by true stories, but also to be impacted by parables, by fiction stories. And Jesus used this concept himself when he was teaching through parables. Is that part of what inspired you?
I think on a general level, just as a writer, yes, definitely. I'm definitely inspired by the way that Jesus used parables in story form to teach very deep theological truths. I love the way that story is more accessible, sometimes breaking those truths into real life settings that we can more immediately relate to. So yes, I was definitely inspired by the way that Jesus used story to teach those who listen to him.
And we receive story in the same space in our unconscious mind directly that we would music or smell. And that's where our memories are, in that same part of the brain where we're listening to and absorbing the story. Whereas a nonfiction story or message or teaching, we are going to parse that out and put up some roadblocks and judge and have to think through that a little bit more clearly. But story we're more open to. And I wonder if you would talk about how that opens us up to be able to receive things a little bit better.
What strikes me is that nonfiction sometimes can feel like you're being instructed, or, and I'll just speak for myself on that. Sometimes that roadblock for me with nonfiction is that it feels like a sermon, or it feels like I'm being corrected in some way. And sometimes that can rise the defenses a little bit. But with story, it's, to use this phrase, it feels safer. It feels safer for me to step into someone else's shoes who maybe is learning that lesson. And so I'm not the one actually receiving the lesson, but I am watching someone else do it. And in that way, it's kind of more objective. I'm looking at it from an outsider's perspective, but I'm still feeling some of the same emotions. I'm still wrestling with some of the same questions that character is wrestling with. And so in that way, I find that I am more receptive on certain topics in a fiction format than I am in a nonfiction format. But the beautiful thing is, fiction often leads to nonfiction. You know, when I have received a story in a fictional format, I am more likely then to possibly then study it further, a more factual context, whether that's seeking out books about, say, I read a book about forgiveness, a novel about forgiveness, and I watched this character grow in her journey to learn how to forgive. And that has inspired me then to follow that example. well, I'm more likely then to seek out nonfiction books about forgiveness. I am much more likely to dive into scripture that deals with forgiveness and how that can change our lives and provide a freedom when we forgive. So I kind of see the relation between those two in that way.
That's so true, Sarah, because sometimes we'll go into reading a story and we're open to whatever the story tells us. So we'll recognize things that we didn't realize we needed in the story, whereas you have to kind of know what you're looking for when you're heading for nonfiction.
Yeah, I would say that that's true. Yes. And I think that's true in my experience as well. I tend to pick up a nonfiction book that I feel particularly led to. It's a topic that I truly want to explore. Whereas fiction kind of opens me up to maybe topics that I didn't know that I wanted to explore. And it's kind of a gateway into that.
Speaking of gateways, gateways can be good or they can be not good. So depending on the stories that we allow into our lives, we can be shaped by them in positive or negative ways. Can you talk about some of the dangers and risks of how vulnerable we are when we are absorbing stories?
Yes, I think that's a great point. There are stories out there that, I think of a theological standpoint, there are plenty of stories out there that maybe take fiction in a different direction that is maybe not biblically sound, introducing reactions to situations in our lives that are maybe not a godly way of handling it. But yet in fiction, it's the hero's journey. And so if the hero is experiencing that situation in a way that is not godly, we may or may not understand that this is not a godly path versus what is a godly path. We need to have discernment when we are approaching fiction, especially as Christians, because there is a tendency for story to be hijacked in such a way that it does take an audience into a direction that can be spiritually very dangerous. I don't want to name books, but there was a book, for instance, in my spiritual journey that revolutionized the way that I thought about a certain spiritual topic. But fortunately, I had someone in my life who was discipling me, and they walked with me through experiencing that particular novel. And they kind of pointed out where it differed from scripture. So it was taking a biblical topic and presenting it in such a way that was not really true. And they were able to point out to me the difference between what scripture actually said and the liberties that the storyteller took that caused the story to go in a very different direction. So I think having discernments, and particularly when it comes to spiritual topics, is very important. Reading in community, I think, is one of those ways that we can safeguard against those dangers.
That's so true. Having community and then also having your own foundation in scripture, not censoring your reading material so that you never read anything that isn't strictly 100% theologically approved of by your Christian community, but doing whatever it is that you're intaking from your world and for your culture that is outside of maybe that Christian bubble with that foundation under you so you can have discernment, and also within community so people can keep you on track. That's really important to know. I know that you have a lot of wonderful resources that can be trusted and that people could invite into their communities. Can you talk about how people can follow you and get some of your amazing Christie Award-winning books?
Absolutely. I love to connect with readers of all stripes and backgrounds, and the best way to find me is sarahbrunsvold.com on my website. I have a number of free downloads there that you are welcome to. I am also on Instagram and Facebook, so would love to interact with you on those platforms if you're there.
I hope that all of you listening were inspired to read some life-changing stories. And of course, I also hope that you will come back for the next episode of Flourishment.